Hi there, my name's Richard Watts from People Make It Work. And as part of the Western Jerwood Creative Bursary OD programme, I want to talk a little bit about how we can understand our organisational culture and then make changes in order to ensure that it's more inclusive and see that as a constant process of change. So when we talk about creating and changing our organisational culture, it can feel like quite an abstract concept. And it can feel quite difficult to understand how we might kind of bring some materiality or some concreteness into that conversation. So today I wanted to share 3 different models that you might use to unpack that. I don't imagine that you'd use all 3, but that you might use one of them depending on your own organisational context and the kinds of changes that you're seeking to make. So I'm going to share some slides as part of this conversation around modifying culture to become more inclusive. And I thought we might share 3 different models: Cameron and Quinn, Edgar Schein, and Johnson and Scholes. But you know, I really want to emphasize that just use the ones that are going to be useful for you. So Cameron and Quinn helps us to think about what kind of culture we've already got. Across a typography, really, that's thinking about how structured it is, how enterprising it is, how internal or external it is, how formal or informal it is. And I think that can be a useful insight for you to then think about, well, how do we talk about our culture in an induction? If we've got a very informal culture, it can be quite hard to penetrate and understand for new entrants. If we've got a very formal culture, it might be easy to understand, but it might feel quite alien in terms of their practices within the organisation. So Cameron and Quinn can help you to identify the type of structural culture that you have. So we'll have a look at that in a sec. And for some of you, that might be really useful to surface that and understand it. But what it doesn't really do is look at some of your habits and behaviours at the level of inclusion. Edgar Schein's model thinks about culture as having like 3 levels: cultural artefacts, the things that we can witness and experience; espoused culture, how we talk about our culture and values; and underlying beliefs, what's truly happening underneath the surface that might be unknown, but shapes the experiences that we have. And then thirdly, Johnson and Scholes Culture Web is another way of kind of surfacing the culture we currently have, understanding that in quite concrete terms, which then enables you to both talk about it, explore it collaboratively, and identify interventions that you might make that would have a material effect on how others experience your culture. So I'm going to just talk through those now in a little bit of detail. So first of all, we're looking at Cameron and Quinn's types of culture. So Cameron and Quinn, this is from 1999. Cameron and Quinn think about these 4 elements: the clan culture, the adhocracy culture, the market culture, and the hierarchical culture. And they think about these axes of how flexible is our organisational culture, or how stable, and how internal, and how external. So clan cultures are really good for collaborating, adhocracy cultures are really good for creating, market cultures are really good for competing, and hierarchical cultures are really good for controlling. If we're thinking about changing our culture or changing within our culture, then you're going to have to do different things if you've got a very strong hierarchical culture in order to make change than you would if you've got a strong clan culture in order to make change. You need to use different levers if you want to create change in an adhocracy culture than you would in a market culture. So understanding the kind of culture you've got can be quite useful for then thinking, what does that mean to new entrants coming into our organisation? And also, what might be the sensible levers that we can pull to create change in our organisation in a way that's aligned with the dominant cultural type? So I'm just going to break that down a little bit, but I know this isn't a kind of master's in organisation development, so I'm not going to go into tons of detail. But and these slides will all be shared in the Slack channel, so you can kind of get at them there. A clan culture is kind of like a sort of family environment where, you know, the leaders, a facilitator, are very sort of committed, lots of development. And often we see that in a clan culture, it's not so much the kind of positional power, it's proximity power. Am I close to the leader? Am I close to people making decisions? So a clan culture can feel very friendly, but when we think about other people coming into it, then it can be quite troublesome because I might not understand what's really going on. And what's really going on might not be written into an organogram or might not be in policies and procedures. So it's more informal, it's very values-based, but it's internal and flexible if we think about those original axes. So an adhocracy model is still still flexible on that initial 4 axes, but it's more externally orientated. So an example of this kind of organization might be a new IT company. They tend to be innovative. They're very much focused on flexibility and the outside world. What's needed right now in this organization? So lots of innovation, lots of testing what's happening in the world. So if you've got an adhocracy culture, then what that means is that new entrants will likely kind of arrive. The organisation is interested in newness and it's interested in external perspectives. So it's quite likely to welcome new voices into the organisation. And it's not so structured that those voices are excluded. So in some ways, if we're thinking about inclusion, an adhocracy culture can be quite useful. The third area is the market culture. If I just spin back, this is this bottom right-hand corner. So it's externally orientated, but rather than orientating to flexibility, it's orientating to stability. So the kinds of organizations that might be here are big telecoms companies, big airline companies, those kinds of organizations. They're orientated to the exterior, but they're also quite structured and embedded. And if we think about cultural organizations, you know, some of the bigger cultural institutions will have quite firm ways of working and quite, you know, institutionalized practices. They're still looking at the outside, but they're, you know, more fixed. And quite often in a market culture, we're looking at how to find efficiencies. We're focused on those kinds of goals, less focused on community and relationships within the organization. And finally, we've got a sort of hierarchy. So this is internally orientated and structured, that bottom left-hand corner. So this might be more like an arts council, local authority, BBC, those kinds of organizations where things are in boxes and we navigate by understanding those different boxes. So if we're coming into this culture, then things will be very defined, but I might be defined out of the organization. It might have been fixed before I arrived, and so kind of getting included can be quite difficult in this culture. So if you're interested in this kind of work, here's an example of a test that we did at People Make It Work a few years ago. You can do a questionnaire online for free, and it will give you, as you can see on this graph, a present culture. You can see that in People Make It Work, we're quite clan and adhocracy orientated. So orientated towards flexibility in and outside, not so orientated to structure and stability. And at the time we were doing this, evidently we were answering questions that said, in the future, we'd like to build more policy, procedure and stability into the way we worked. That strength of adhocracy means that there's quite a lot of fluidity and enabling of change. but it also means that things aren't always so procedural, and that might lead to a lack of safety if we've not got those processes and procedures built in. If you're interested in doing more around that, you can get a quick free test at ocai-online.com. You can find paper tests at Boom. I don't know how to say that actually, so I'm not going to try, but you can see the website there. And then finally, there's a book, if you're interested in digging into this further, that's available on Amazon and other book retailers. So that process is quite useful if you're trying to get a sense of what kind of culture have we got structurally. It doesn't tell you about our beliefs, but it tells you about your kind of habits of orientation, and that might be helpful for thinking about what it will take to make change, and also what the experience of somebody coming into that environment might be. The second area that I wanted to just share right now was to think about Edgar Schein's levels of culture. I really love this model, and it digs more into meaning and more into experience. So I love Edgar Schein. He's based at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he's a lovely, wrinkly man. And he has been, established work around organisation development for a great deal of time. And I really like these three levels of culture that he thinks about. So he talks about cultural artifacts, the things on the surface of our organisation that you can see and experience. So those artifacts might include things like how we book meetings, what's on agendas, but it's also like experiences. What's the welcome feel like? How do we meet? How do we make decisions? Who do we listen to? How are decisions reached? Who's late? How do we support each other? What are the rules? What are the informal rules? How does it feel in this organisation? So those cultural artifacts have got a really broad span, and I think it's a really rich way of thinking about our culture and turning it from like cloudy ideas of culture to real things like, how do decisions get made? How does it feel to disagree? What happens when you ask questions? Those are artifacts, they're cultural objects in our organisation, their experiences. So mapping them and surfacing them can be really helpful for making culture visible and making it conscious, and then we can think about doing something about it. The second layer that Edgar talks about are espoused values. So this is what we say our values are and what we say our culture is. So very often you see those on a website, in a funding application, in a board meeting. You might see them on signs around the organisation, in which case they then become cultural artifacts too. But the important thing to see is that our espoused values and our lived values that are evident through our artifacts might well be different. In the most aligned organisations, those things will be really clear and authentic together, but in lots of organisations, they'll be a bit out of whack. And what people experience isn't what's espoused. And when we talk about our culture, if we just refer to our espoused values rather than our lived experience, then we're denying the reality of our culture. So when we're thinking about an induction, it's not helpful to be describing out of date or inauthentic espoused values as if they're true right now. We need to be talking about some of those cultural artifacts. And in order to talk about them, we might need to surface them. And then finally, Edgar talks about basic underlying assumptions, what's actually shaping our behaviour. And this is often unknown. So it isn't part of our narrative, it isn't part of what we articulate. It might be in our organisational mission or a charitable object. It might be in our it's kind of our DNA, our cultural DNA, and it gives rise to artifacts, but and it even gives rise to espoused values, but sometimes it's unspoken and unknown. And by doing some work, we can really get clear about what that is. It's not our espoused values. I mean, in a few organisations it is, but most often there's some others. So let's have a look at sort of how we might do something with that. So a methodology that you could explore is ask everyone. Ask people to take pictures, to cut and paste, to share, to bring together evidence and artifacts that show how we do things around here. Ask people, show me what you notice. What epitomizes our culture? What do you experience day in, day out? If you're newer, what jarred, or what did you really notice when you came? Because these artifacts can become invisible to long-term residents in an organization. So they may be things like I'd love to, things that we laminate are significant in this, but also how we make decisions. What are our processes and procedures? Who's in the room? Who's not in the room? How do we decide that? How are we having those conversations? These are all cultural artifacts. So gathering those, gathering evidence of our espoused values, looking online, looking at our sales materials or our annual reports, perhaps asking leaders what they say about the organisation, what they hope to be true. And then you can go through a process of collectively, collaboratively sorting to understand the underlying beliefs that give rise to these artifacts. So what I tend to see is that when you look at that work, you find that a bunch of things add up to something. So maybe there's a bunch of artifacts that mean we value multiple voices. And you'd see that from how we make decisions, from how we make work, from how we plan, from how we imagine our future, from how many people are involved in a document, or what kinds of meetings we have. So you gather artifacts and see what they add up to as an underlying belief. You might have one that says it's not safe to challenge. And, we gather evidence of that. Nobody would ever say that's an underlying belief of our organisation, but the artifacts might show that that's the case, or that there's certain things it's not safe to challenge, and that's an underlying belief. So you can see how this process can be really valuable if you do it collaboratively, to look for evidence to support perspectives. And in my experience, when you get those underlying beliefs right and play them back to some members of the team, it's a bit like, it's slightly chilling, and you go, oh my God, that's so true. And, or else you get a bit of anger that means we've not quite got it right yet. But often with underlying beliefs, when we're asked about them, why they're true, they generate either anger or confusion because they're operating beyond our conscious notice. So for instance, if you ask somebody in, in British society, why are all people of equal merit? That's likely, that probably, for many of us, that's an underlying belief, but it's never tested. And so when you ask why, you're quite likely to get belligerent responses or confusion. And that says to me, that's an underlying belief. We've kind of got one there. We're operating at that level. And the artifacts that show it are things that we're familiar with, but we're not familiar with exploring that idea. I hope that's helpful and not too fuzzy. So having gone through that kind of process, you can then decide what to address and refine. You might identify artifacts that indicate specific changes that are needed, how we're making decisions, who we're listening to, how we're prioritizing particular voices, or how we're denying particular perspectives. That feels like an artifact that's just like direct intervention required to reset how we deal with that particular thing. The underlying beliefs that are surfaced through this process might also describe some beliefs that need to shift now and over time. Some of those beliefs might need urgent action, and some might need progressive, iterative change. That's only to be decided by you. So this second methodology is about understanding our culture in concrete ways by gathering artifacts, looking at our espoused values and drawing attention to those artifacts and deciding what needs to change. And if we want to go that step further, understanding the underlying beliefs that give rise to those artifacts in a kind of anthropological way, and testing those underlying beliefs. Are they right for us and for our times? And if not, identifying interventions that we can make at all levels in the organisation to make shift. The more people you involve in this process, the more people that are already committed to making those changes as a result of the insights that come through. So the third model that I wanted to share with you is kind of similar in some ways to what we've just been talking about with Edgar Schein, and that's Johnson and Scholes Culture Web. Now, I really like this model too. Again, it helps us move from like the abstract idea of culture down to a set of things, 6 things that make up our paradigm. What are our routines and rituals in our organisation? They're culturally formed and culturally formative. What symbols have power in our organisation? They're culturally formed and culturally formative. What controls are there in our organisation? They're culturally formed and culturally formative. What's our organisational structures? Again, they're culturally formed and culturally formative. What's our power structures? And what are our myths and stories? They add up to creating a paradigm, a way of thinking about our organisation. Now, if those things are either orientating to an excluding narrative of us and the other, or are unconsciously replicating colonial ideas, or patriarchal ideas, or ideas that aren't aligned with our own organisational mission, then we need to make changes to them, don't we? So to put a bit of detail around that, you can ask these questions to uncover the myths and stories, the routines and rituals, the symbols of the organisation. And again, I think this can be a collaborative process. Do these myths and stories, do these routines and rituals, do these symbols serve us in who we intend to be? And if not, then culture change is needed. And culture change at this level, both it is formed, the activities that generate new stories are culturally formative, and then those new myths and stories help to shape the culture of the future, don't they? And the more people that are involved in these conversations, the more we're opening up and surfacing and uncovering the paradigm. So, you know, some examples: morning meetings, Christmas parties, the way the phone is answered. They're routines and rituals that embed practice in our organisation. What are our myths and stories? If you look at someone like Alan Lane at Slung Low, there's myths and stories Alan tells about the organisation that are culturally formative and have shaped the culture that exists today. And they make inevitable some things in the future because they shape the culture. So let's be like the story that we tell affects the culture we have and the reality that we're creating. Power structures, organizational structures and controls are the infrastructure that holds us in place. So an exercise exploring these models, unpacking these in really concrete, practical ways with colleagues, with board members, with new entrants into the organisation in order to understand what they notice, what they see, can be really helpful for turning culture from this invisible software that we feel we have no control over and that controls us, into a tapestry that we're weaving, that we have agency over and that we can shape. It's still got power over us, but we can choose how to make that culture, because we're culturally formative ourselves. Those of us who are leaders in organisations have the most culturally formative influence, and can set the tone and temperature that enables the culture to evolve and develop at pace. And that's down to us, isn't it? It's down to us to shape that as part of our roles, which is why we have an organisation development programme as part of the Western Jerwood Creative Bursary programme. I hope those three models are helpful. They might not be for now. You might want to access them later in the programme or later in the year. There's another set of models that I shared around our 8 elements of change that's in another video from last week. You might find that useful too. If you're thinking about, having worked out that there's some stuff we like to shift, how do we go about making some of that shift happen? I think the other session that I shared with you might be useful in that context. The other thing you can do is give us a shout for a one-to-one conversation. We'd be delighted every time to receive those requests. So do give us a shout if we can help. Thanks very much, and I hope that's useful. I'll be talking about some of these ideas in the coming weeks, and really happy to explore them in kind of Q&A and one-to-one conversations whenever that's useful. Have a really good conversation around culture when it's the right time for you, and thanks very much.